welcome back, everyone, from lunch. I hope everyone had a chance to enjoy some of the nice Irish sunshine we had this afternoon here, actually. Prime Minister Brnovich, thank you so much for joining us. I want to start by having you paint a bit of a picture of the modern-day Serbia. I was reading your background, and you grew up in Belgrade, but then you yourself spent time studying in the U.S. and then in the U.K., and then you went back to Serbia, and you were working for NGOs, and you were actually in the private sector for quite a long time before you got into politics. Talk to me about how the country has evolved and changed.
Well, it has changed a lot, really, quite considerably. And I'll tell you a few numbers. Basically, 10, 11 years ago, 2012, the unemployment in Serbia was above 25%. Youth unemployment was above 51%. We had basically a huge problem with rising public debt. We had a huge problem with the budget deficit, and it just seemed as though Serbia is not moving in the right direction. Then political changes happened. Current President Aleksandar Vučić in 2014 took over the government as the Prime Minister. I joined the government on his invitation in 2016, right straight from the private sector, so I wasn't in the politics, but I saw that he's doing good things for Serbia, and I wanted to be part of it. I wanted to help out. Today, Serbia's unemployment is about 9%. We have been in the past 7 or 8 years proclaimed by the Financial Times as the world leaders in FDI attraction compared to the size of our economy. We have, in the past 10 years, created over 450,000 jobs. And IT sector became the fastest growing sector of our economy, to the point that in 2021, that's the latest data that we have, in 2021, every second new job created was in the ICT sector. So it really is something that came out of our belief in investing in people, in education, in research and development, and building on something that all of us in the region have, and that is traditionally strong STEM education. But we thought that we should put all of our eggs into that basket and really change Serbia in order to make up for all of the lost time in the 90s, early 2000s. And the change has been unbelievable. It has been amazing. I'll also tell you, the average salary literally doubled in the past 10 years.
One of the things that we were talking about backstage is this investment in the IT sector and sort of how you're trying to do that also when it comes into the education system as well. And I was reading that you're teaching coding in all of the primary schools. Talk to us a little bit about that and how that has been going.
Yes, in 2017, we made this important decision to introduce coding as a mandatory subject in our primary schools. From the 5th grade, that's when kids are 10, 11 years old. And so as of 2017, they learn Scratch and Python, Pygame. And in 2021, we had the first generation of primary school kids leaving school with the knowledge of coding, which has tremendously, I think, impacted not just them. Obviously, we will see the result of that investment in the next few years, but I think their parents, their families, the way they perceive our country and the future of our country. We have also, to couple that, we have introduced and increased specialized IT, number of specialized IT classes in the secondary schools, and invested approximately 300 million euros now into tech faculties to increase their capacities, but also into science and technology parks across Serbia. So now we have 4 big science and tech parks that are basically there to promote and support our startup and innovation companies. what has been surprising also is that, I mean, as I said, being kind of a former socialist, communist country, we have traditionally strong STEM education. And so, from that, if you invest, we figured that if you invest even small amount of money into that, you will get quick and big return on your investment. And that is precisely what has happened. In 2019, Startup Genome report is, for the first time, actually also included Serbia in its analysis. And already at that time, we were proclaimed in world top 10 ecosystems in affordable talent and gaming, and I think top 5 in blockchain. And so, it has been almost a generic growth, and what you needed was just the government to actually see that, understand that, recognize it, and invest into it. And as I said, today it's the foremost sector of our economy driving the growth.
Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you've also had a lot of Russians who have come to Serbia and are now working there, and you were telling me it's actually been a real benefit to your tech sector as well then, these people.
It has. I will also tell you, I mean, this investment has helped us also, in addition, in parallel with basically helping the economy grow, also helping the average salary grows. It has helped us enormously in reversing the brain drain in Serbia. So we were one of the countries, like everywhere else in the Balkans region, with a huge problem of brain drain. We have managed to reverse it. And so now we have, when you look at the category of highly skilled younger population, we have more of them coming back than leaving the country. So we have managed to reverse the brain drain. There's also more and more foreigners coming to work in Serbia because we have introduced a special tax incentives for those workers that are in deficit, highly skilled tech people, AI people, biotech, life sciences. And so we have more and more of them coming. But also when the war in Ukraine broke out, we have had a lot of inflow of Russian engineers, mostly very young, very skilled, very talented people who either came to Serbia because they were working for Western companies that pulled out of Russia and relocated to Serbia, or Russian IT companies that with Western partners, clients, who have decided that they want to relocate, and then they found Serbia to be the best place to relocate for basically 2 reasons, to be perfectly honest. One is because we are becoming well known as a good tech destination with a favored business environment and business climate, a lot of government support, a lot of investment in education, but also because I feel that they did not feel welcome elsewhere. Although these young people are mostly really Western-oriented, very well educated, against the war, and that is, something that is, I think, lost for Europe. Is that that Europe did not feel they did not feel welcomed in Europe, but it's a good thing for us, and they brought a lot of knowledge that otherwise we couldn't actually create ourselves, or not quick enough.
You have always tried to, from an investment point of view, do this balancing act between the EU, US, Russia, China. Is that getting more difficult?
I would not say that it was a balancing act as such, although it may seem so. It was more of the fact that we needed to catch up on all of the lost opportunities and all of the wasted time. To do that, for a country like Serbia, you need to be open for all of the investors and all of the investments and all of the capital to come in and build the country. And so we were very open, as you have said. Our economy is actually, in that respect, when you look at kind of geopolitics, quite diversified. I would say if you look at, for example, our number one partner in trade in goods is Germany, by far. The strongest partner and the biggest investor in Serbia. When you look at trade exchange in services, it's the United States. But the biggest exporter from Serbia is a Chinese company that acquired our copper mill. So it is very diversified. But it wasn't purposefully, and it never was a balancing act. It was just openness of our economy and our country to benefit from the capital and investments for the benefit of our people. And I think it was, a smart and pragmatic policies that we pursued. Now, is it getting more difficult? Absolutely. I mean, the world is becoming more and more complicated and more complex place, and it is getting more and more polarized, and it is quite difficult. But what's important is that you have arguments for your policies, and that you explain to people why is it good for your country and for your people, and that it has nothing to do with geopolitics as such, and kind of friends versus enemies. When you look at Western Europe has benefited enormously from Chinese investments. And, now when Chinese investments are present in Eastern Europe or in the Balkans, there are some partners from Western Europe who says, well, it's not okay. But we need those investments. What we cannot afford, though, is to be overexposed in terms of public debt. We keep that under control because as of 2014, continuously, as country we have been working with, we have had a standing arrangement with International Monetary Fund, IMF. And so we needed them to be kind of a credible partner who will also oversee our public finances and will testify towards foreign investors or financial institutions that we are a good, solid country on the right track.
Your president told us in an interview in January that his relationship with President Putin has cooled since the invasion. I'm wondering how you would characterize Serbia's relationship with Russia today, and do you see any possibility that you would ever join in sanctions, or is that just a red line that Serbia isn't going to cross?
So I will tell you that there is, in my view, a common misperception that Serbia is kind of neutral in this conflict. And it's not. Serbia has aligned with all of the EU and UN resolutions and declarations which have condemned the Russian aggression of Ukraine. Why? Because we think that it's a clear breach of international law, the attack against other sovereign nation, and that there is a kind of sanctity of territorial integrity of internationally recognized countries that cannot be a breach under any circumstances. So in that respect, in terms of values, we are 100% aligned with our EU partners. Sanctions are different because we have been subjected to sanctions back in the 90s. Our people feel strongly against sanctions because our view is that sanctions do not actually diminish countries' capacity or willingness to wage the war, that they hurt those most vulnerable within a population or a country. But we also have to say our people feel frustrated because the territorial integrity of Serbia has been breached. And the double standards is something that puts Serbia into a specific situation. So in terms of our relationship to the Russian Federation, yes, we did not want to introduce sanctions, but we have clearly said that we condemned the aggression, and we were one of the first countries actually in Europe to come out officially, publicly, to say that we are not going to ever recognize the results of the 4 referenda that took place in Ukraine, in Donetsk and Lugansk, that for us, we are not going to recognize it. So, that is something that certainly is impacting, obviously, our relationship with the Russian Federation. But the problem with the world that I see is that in the polarized world, you can't even be neutral, So we're not neutral, but it's either you are fully for or fully against, for someone or against someone. And we have aligned in values, but in terms of sanctions, we do not believe in those sanctions.
There were some reports last week based on leaked U.S. documents that Serbia has, in fact, supplied arms to Ukraine. Can you say anything about that, if that is true?
Sure. We have never supplied weapons to either Russian Federation or Ukraine since the aggression started in February 2022. We have quite a strong military industry, again, traditionally, back from the times of the former Yugoslavia. We sell ammunition mostly, but we sell it to the recognized end users. But that does not include Russian Federation or Ukraine.
You are looking at or wanting to join the EU. One of the things that will be important in that process is mending the relationship with Kosovo. How do you see that process moving forward?
It is a very difficult process. It is a very emotional process for us. But that is something that has also changed in Serbia with, thanks to, in great part to the President Aleksandar Vučić, who said, listen, we need to have an internal dialogue on this and we need to focus on the future. We owe this to the generation that are coming after us, to the younger generations. And we want to try and find mutually acceptable compromise with Pristina. And 10 years ago, almost exactly to date, actually, it was yesterday, it was 10 years ago since the signing of the first agreement on normalization between Belgrade and Pristina, is also known as the Brussels Agreement. Now, the backbone of the Brussels Agreement was the establishment of the community of Serb municipalities, and that was basically the only thing that Pristina needed to do. We have implemented from our side everything that was needed to be implemented by Belgrade or Serbia or Serbs in Kosovo and Metohija. But to date, Pristina still did not form the community of Serb municipalities. And so that is, to me, the biggest obstacle for any other agreement. So now we had good discussions, difficult but good discussions, both in Brussels and Ohrid in March. But again, the first thing is the full implementation of the first agreement on normalization, and that is the establishment of the community of Serb municipalities. So not to bore this, this group, this meeting, this panel with the details. Really what we need is Pristina to step up its efforts and implement what has been agreed 10 years ago, also guaranteed by the European Union, in order to then go further and implement other agreements. Now, Serbia has a vested interest in regional stability. As I have said, we have done so much to change our destiny and to see clear prospects for the future for our country and our people. But we live in a relatively small, very interconnected region. Any instability will directly negatively affect our prospects and our stability. So we have vested interest to work towards regional stability, and in that respect also are very, very dedicated to this dialogue in order to preserve peace and stability, and we owe it to the younger generation to try and build a more prosperous and different Balkans.
Prime Minister, we are unfortunately out of time. I could ask another 20 questions here. I have them in front of me. We'll save that for the next meeting. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Please welcome Amir Morandi, co-founder and Chief Executive Officer, Zavr; Elizabeth Rossiello, Chief Executive Officer and Founder, Asa Finance; David Snedden, Vice President, Google; and Bloomberg's Morwenna Coniam.
Good afternoon, and welcome to what I hope will be a thought-provoking discussion on building a thriving knowledge economy. And I'm aware we're nearing the end of our programme, so I do hope it will be lively. So we'll be looking at what makes a country attractive for companies to invest in. And not that just that, but to build and stay and contribute to economic growth. We'll be looking at how Europe can attract and retain talent, expertise, and ambition. 2023, it's already seen a slew of European companies choose to abandon their domestic listings in favour of US markets. And we've got more that are expected to follow. Meanwhile, Europe is lagging the US in terms of deep technology companies. And that poses a challenge as economic growth is increasingly pinned to digitization. Of course, the fallout and the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank has also dealt a further blow to startups as funding dries up and banks de-risk. So what do future solutions look like? And is regulation, talent, governance, tax, or other incentives the answer? Well, with us, we have three corporate leaders who are tackling some of these issues. We have David Snedden, the Vice President of Google, and he leads the GTech professional services team across the EMEA region. He represents about 21,000 Google employees across the region, and he's one of the company's Irish site leads. Then we have Elizabeth Rossiello. She's the CEO and founder of Asa Finance, which is an established provider of international payment solutions across more than 115 countries. And Amir Morandi, the co-founder and CEO of Zavr, a Swedish-based growing European fintech which provides size-agnostic real-time payments processing. Before I turn to our panelists, we do have a polling question. And that is, we want you to answer, what is the most important consideration in locating or relocating a business? And I think you can scan the QR code if you haven't already, and we would love to know what you think is the most important thing. So it looks... Access to talent is in the lead, which is actually very interesting, as that is something we're hearing across the board in all industries that I've been talking to. I cover Ireland at Bloomberg, and it constantly comes up that talent is a challenge at the moment, especially in Ireland, where we have almost full employment. And that was the first topic that I was going to turn to for our panelists. Unemployment in the European economic area is broadly declining. And one of the things that we frequently hear, as I said, is companies are struggling to attract talent. And even as we're seeing some headline layoffs from large technology companies, of course. So I'm interested in what employers can do, and also what governments can do to help build and sustain the required expertise for European companies to grow and for companies to grow in Europe. So, Amir, I'm going to start with you. As an entrepreneur building a company in Europe, what are the challenges when it comes to recruiting and retaining talent? And what do you need to see to overcome them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think the battle of talent is, first of all, it's an international battle. So we're competing with Asia, we're competing with China, we're competing with the US. And I think these topics are way, way larger than just flexibility or the perks that you can offer one another. Because as a tech company, if you look at the business world has solved this, if you're a lead generator, you will receive a kickback for every lead you basically generate. But for us as a tech company to bring in talent, intelligent people outside the EU to Sweden, it's a big hassle. It costs us a lot of money. It's a lot of administrative work. And you sometimes just don't do that. So I would say if we want to have the smartest MIT engineers joining the Swedish ecosystem, we really need to create the incentives for them. Right? You cannot tell this engineer to come to this country and promise them that they will be taxed 60% on their stock option programs. So you have to build the incentives in order to attract talent. You have to make it easier to bring intelligent people outside the EU to the EU, because these people will contribute to the further development of these societies. So I would say, I hope our regulators and the governments start to realize it's not a domestic battle between us and another Swedish payments company. It's between us and the rest of the world, and we need to create incentives needed in order to make these people want to come to these regions.
And Elizabeth, what's your experience been, and what do you see as the potential for improvement in making people want to come to this region, but also in helping people move across the region? Because I know that you work in different countries.
Right, so we have 5 offices globally, main offices, and another 3 satellite offices. And for us, it's very important to have local teams. So we operate in East, Central, West Africa. We bought a company in South Africa, so brought on 50 people there. But up above the equator, we have offices in Madrid and London. It's almost impossible for us to bring our talent up to the UK. We have 2 licenses to sponsor permits each year, so the maximum we can bring on of non-British talent is 2 a year. And to hire British engineers, it's very difficult to make them come into the office. Post-COVID, even pre-COVID, nobody wants to live in London. It's so expensive for young engineers. So we had to make an exception to our policy, even pre-COVID, that they could be remote. So some of them are in Scotland or maybe other parts of Europe. I think it's hard to have a traditional workforce if you're not paying, no offense, Google salaries or more. So that's a struggle. And what we've seen actually is that we have so much more talent developing in our African offices. 10 years ago, it was very hard to hire a senior engineer, a security, InfoSec professional. Now we see that market really exploding. And, for us, it's important to have cycling of employees through the offices. So we have a lot of employees spend 2 years at different offices and move between to create a really important overall culture. And that free movement is a lot easier between our African offices and even Madrid than it is to the UK. So that's a struggle for us.
No, that's very interesting. And I think it's a potential for improvement there in making those transitions easier.
I mean, certainly. We've been bringing up two more each year from the UK. The UK has, even post-Brexit, despite inflation, despite housing costs, it does have a cachet with a lot of our team members. They want to live in a big metropolis. The schooling is great. So I think for the employees, there is still some pull for that. But definitely for our employees under 30, they want lifestyle. They want to live, in a place where they have, space. They're near the sun. They want to move from Madrid to Valencia. There's a big internal poll trying to persuade me to open up a Valencia office. So I think, when I was in my 20s, I was working in Canary Wharf. I don't think I ever breathed fresh air or saw the sun, and I was content with that. It's a completely different world that we're living in, especially post-COVID, and even pre-COVID, it was difficult. So I think employers need to just adapt their expectations of their workforce. And I was just talking to you before that I was recently bullied into making birthdays a holiday. And I was like, what is this request? But it had like 85% approval from my team. And I definitely said no to the 4-day work week, but I gave it on the birthdays. And I think we just have to learn to be adaptive to attract the best talent these days.
At least it's only once a year. David, you're, of course, in a slightly different situation. At a large multinational, and actually in the process of trying to reduce headcount in Europe. I think it's about 240 jobs just in Dublin that are expected to go. How does the ability to attract talent differ in Europe from in other countries, but also the ability to adapt to business needs that you're now experiencing? You have to be able to be flexible. How is that challenge met in Europe, and where do you see opportunities?
We see lots of opportunities. I suppose maybe just to build on what my other two panelists have actually said, I think I'd sort of see the war for talent in two ways. First of all, there's location, lifestyle, and a sort of a hyper choice, largely as a result of the pandemic. We also have a very vigorous internal Google talent market too, and actually, just to answer your question now, actually, sort of both those things come together to a certain extent as we're thinking about this. We use Dublin as our European headquarters. We have about 6,000 people here, and largely working with customers in the advertising and cloud space. And we use that as a kind of a scaling and aggregation point. That's quite helpful, particularly to bring in, say, younger talent. And then we have offices in most European countries, or multiple offices in the larger countries, to which that talent often then moves. So back to that external bringing people in, but also internally providing them with sort of jump-off points. Amir's point is a well-made one. If there are any barriers to immigration or migration around the world, that of course affects companies that almost depend on the sort of slick movement of people around the world. But I would have it as a flag. But what I would say is that we think it's a manageable one. We think Dublin offers a scale. We think there is mobility. It's got to become easier. And my ask for the Irish government in particular would make it easier for people from places like India to come here, because the visa restrictions are quite severe. But I would echo what you're saying about the UK and other countries too. So that would be sort of how we broadly think about it. So it's still a pretty fluid market, but we do need to make sure that it doesn't become less fluid. Because then, to your opening point, then we still think Europe is super attractive, but we wouldn't want barriers to go up to kind of to make mobility, say, in and out of the European Union harder. I think that would be a disadvantage.
And speaking of barriers, of course, as you are letting people go, that is a more difficult process in Europe than it is, say, in the US. And that's just one of many regulations that perhaps is different for companies operating in this region, particularly in terms of employment, but then any other regulations. How is that a constraint, and will that put companies off, do you think, hiring rapidly because they can't then reduce their headcount at the same speed?
We don't really see that. I mean, yes, European workers enjoy a different set of rights to what the American worker enjoys, and there are certain cultural elements a part of that too. But no, I don't see it as a disinhibitor. Big multinationals do business in every single country, and we are really proud of our locations in all of those countries, as well as obviously our American headquarters. On the regulation side, we welcome regulation. It's something, we welcome anything that allows companies to trade successfully in whatever their environment is. We would always try and work very closely with regulators to make sure that it's not a disincentive to doing business, and that's why we would try and partner with as many governments and regulators as possible. But again, I wouldn't raise any of that as a flag. I just think a sort of consistency and stability of environment is probably the most helpful thing, particularly when you're dealing with people in California who maybe don't understand all of the nuances of every single country.
Yeah. And Amir, from your perspective, the regulations, I know we talked before that perhaps they're interpreted differently in different countries. How do you find trying to grow and decide which countries to expand into? What are the challenges there, and what do you think could be done better?
Yeah, so, Saver is a Swedish payment institution under the supervision of the Swedish FSA. And so we have been exposed to a bit of, regulatory stuff. And the problem is, we have the Second Payment Services Directive Act, for instance, just as an example, which is harmonized to, the majority of it at least. But we really need more clearer answers on how to look at certain important questions. Like, Sweden cannot have this kind of view when it comes to AML, and Germany another one, because obviously we can passport our licenses, we can operate in different kind of markets with the licenses within the EEA, but we really should, from a governmental perspective, give the answer on what is right and what is wrong. Otherwise, we try to say that the companies and the private market should decide that, and when something goes wrong, we still are not happy with that. So I would really like to have more clearer framework on how we should act in certain questions, because sometimes that's not really clear between the countries.
And Elizabeth, what about you? The challenges between operating in different countries and regulations being applied differently?
Well, honestly, I'm inspired that you're even complaining about it, because I thought that was business as usual. I'm operating in 100 countries, and we have AML drop-down menus that are completely different in all of them, and I just assumed that was normal, but I'm glad to hear that maybe there's hope for that to be harmonized. I think, I lived 7 years in East Africa, where the East African community couldn't harmonize amongst 3 countries. And I did my thesis 20 years ago on the European Union, and we still have issues with the harmonization there. So I think, I'm a pragmatist, and I understand that it's different, and I think that's a barrier to entry for companies that can manage that complexity. I'd love to see it harmonized, but like I said before, I have a lot of my Nigerian colleagues manage to finally get a UK resident permit, but then they can't visit my Spanish office because they don't have a Schengen visa. So we just kind of assume that this is part of the deal, and we work around it. Obviously, it would be great if it would be harmonized, but I think there's so much left in the payments industry and in the fintech industry in a greater sense to be developed. We're still very young in comparison.
Okay, thank you. And I think it is an ongoing challenge of how to address those, but you have managed to navigate it in many different places so far. I wanted to turn now to listings, which I mentioned, and perhaps we could start with you, Elizabeth. I know that you have considered an IPO before, but have decided not to. And I'm interested in, how exchanges in Europe can attract companies to list with them and then support their growth there. We've seen such high-profile losses already this year, Arm shunning the UK, CRH opting for the US, and Diageo dropping its Dublin and Paris listing. So I'm interested to hear from all of you what you think the disincentives are at the moment, but how can exchanges compete?
Yeah, great question. So 10 years ago, we were part of the first fintech movement in the African continent. And in 10 years, there's been less than a dozen unicorns. And some of those African unicorns, I would argue, maybe aren't even African. Not because of who they are, but where their business operations lie. So I think we don't have the data points to show that it's successful. And the London Stock Exchange had a feeder program for rising African companies. We've been a part of the program for many years, pushing them towards the AIM small cap exchange. We've been working with NASDAQ. We've seen a lot of fintechs around the world list in Amsterdam or Toronto. But we still don't have the data set that shows that it's a pathway a lot of companies can go down. And I think that then cycles back into the lack of investment, not only in the sector, but in the region. And then the double whammy of, fintechs in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think, until we see that data set, it's a chicken and an egg, it's hard to go forward with that listing. And the second thing, which we talked about earlier, is that in a bear market, all the gremlins come out, and we've had so much activist research for a lot of payment companies with, I think, dLocal, there was one with FleetCor, Block and Square have seen that happen all in the last few months. And, that's, again, a hurdle that a lot of companies will have to overcome right after IPO. So I think so many companies think about IPO, but what happens after? It's like I tell new parents, don't worry about the birth and delivery. It's the next 18 years. So, I think we need to get real about how much further in the process we need to go before the cycle really matures.
And Amir, what does the market landscape look like to you as you're expanding in Europe?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously we're not looking at IPOing right now, but I would say like one of the biggest challenges I see that we have in Europe compared to the US, if you have an entrepreneur building a successful tech company such as, let's say, Spotify, it's a shame it's not listed in Stockholm, right? But I really understand the reasons behind it, because you need to have institutional investors who understand tech companies, who understand how you put a price tag on Spotify versus Ericsson or Saab, because it's totally different business models. And if that understanding is really not there at that market, it's going to be problematic. Just to give you an example, I mean, Germany is the fourth largest economy in the world after US, China, and Japan, and the largest one in Europe. But the Frankfurt Stock Exchange is too small. It's a fraction of what it should be, because culturally maybe people actually had their money in deposit accounts, etc. So one of the things is like, I think we should try to educate the market in Europe. Like we today know that maybe we should teach people software engineering at a lower age in the schools. Why are we not teaching people from an early stage how the stock market works? You shouldn't have to go to a business school in order to understand the basics of this and get the retail people with you.
That's a very interesting point, and perhaps a contrast to in the US. David, obviously working across different continents, do you find that is something that the financial knowledge and awareness and appetite for it is different in the EMEA?
I think it's funny. I might reframe that, because I'm not an expert in as my panelists are in this space. But what I might reframe it: 20 years ago, no one had ever heard of the words Trivago, Amazon, and other companies that we now completely take for granted, who have subsequently gone through the process of IPOing, and obviously now sort of stock market behemoths either in the US or here in Europe. And I think if I could just take it to an even slightly earlier stage, even than birth, maybe conception, if I could stretch your analogy, and to say it's absolutely vital that governments, regulators, and where organisations like Google can provide any support, help the next generation of companies emerge. And I think in the US, if you just look at just the physical amount of tech companies that have either born there or have acquired their European equivalents, for example, both Booking and Trivago were acquired by US organisations eventually. I think that's actually something that even before they get to sort of their fully fledged stage, I think we need to provide more support. It can't be the case that it's just easier to birth one of those organisations in the US than it is here. So that's something we feel really passionate about, and supporting small, fast-growing businesses, I think is the mandate of all of us, particularly in the tech industry.
Yeah, and that is something I did want to touch on, actually, both from bigger companies, but also from governments. What social, financial policies, or even physical infrastructure, which does still matter, especially when we're talking about people. What do you think that companies need to start and grow? Perhaps starting with you, David, as we were discussing it.
I think government can provide the kind of fertile seed bed in which organisations can grow. If a government like Ireland, in fact, puts digital at the heart of its economic and social goals, that country will thrive. We see it here in Ireland. Partner at today's conference is the IDA, an incredible partner in really embedding that thinking at the heart of government. And I think that is the single most critical thing. That unlocks talent, that unlocks the innovation, and that sort of maybe gives a sort of aspiration to sort of entrepreneurs in any given country to really grow their business. There's lots of other factors too, but if I was to sort of isolate and define one, I think that's a really, really important one. That seems to be what successful countries like Ireland, Estonia, others have really made the hallmark of their success.
And Elizabeth, what would your perspective be on what governments can do to provide financial, social, or physical infrastructure?
Well, we think about this a lot. We're in 115 markets, but we have 17 physical subsidiaries, or national subsidiaries. So we're constantly shopping for friendly markets. And where do we go to access the region? And in Europe, we ended up we bought a company in Spain for several reasons. Part of the reason is the rule of law there, protecting fintechs with bank accounts. So banks have a tendency sometimes, if they feel like the fintech starts to compete with them, to either raise the fees to 10x or close the account for secretive reasons. And in Spain, you're protected by law from that. So we've found that very helpful. Of course, we went to Luxembourg for our group company, and we actually find it I didn't see any Luxembourg government officials here, so I'll speak, very onerous because of their corporate governance bureaucracy. And, something, you don't think about this when you're starting a fintech or a company, but down the line, several fundraising rounds later, if I need to have the signature of every single shareholder's, 5 children, parents, and pets, every time I do a corporate governance action, it's incredibly difficult and can hold up a fundraiser, can hold up a corporate action. Similarly with the change of control, when we acquire companies or we start to go into M&A. So I think, these things you don't think about at conception, but are definitely very important later on. And then a theme that we've been discussing many times throughout this conference is the pairing of the government and the banking sector. Mm-hmm. So how do corporates work with the government to support new innovative companies? How do incumbents welcome them? And I think that's the unspoken need. Are the incumbents welcoming? In Estonia, all of the corporates have been arms wide open to welcome new innovative companies because, of course, they're competing with larger countries. So I think, countries that want to attract young talent have to think not only of the first stage of welcoming them with incentives, but later on, how does the corporate governance approach function for a smaller company, and then what do the corporates and the financial sector do to welcome those companies as well?
Amir, as a newer company trying to attract young talent, what's your perspective on what you need to see from governments infrastructure-wise on whichever aspect?
Yeah, so, I believe there is this golden rule of the 3 A's, basically. You have to have access to capital, access to talent, and also access to data if you're building technical solutions. And if you have 2 of these but not access to data, it's going to be hard to build new solutions which are purely software. And I see that in a lot of countries within the Central European space. You have these large economies, you have a lot of talent, but access to data is not that developed as it is in the Nordics, where you have open APIs with the governmental authorities. And that's maybe one of the reasons we have so many payments companies coming from Sweden. I don't know, but that is super important. So I would say try to, in a sane way, help these companies access data points so they can, let's say, increase the conversion rate, not only in the checkout, but also the conversion rate from having companies founded at the seed stage later on becoming, actual businesses. So the data discussion is super important, because if you try to be too restrictive, it's going to hurt in a different way.
Well, thank you so much to all our panelists for your fantastic answers. I hope that we'll learn something about what companies need to see in order to be able to grow in Europe and stay in Europe. And I think talent retention and attraction seems to be one of the key themes that people are struggling with, as well as regulation and working across different jurisdictions. So thank you so much to David, Elizabeth, and Amir.
Please welcome Tina Baker-Taylor, Vice President of Policy and Regulatory Strategy, EU-UK, Circle. Marcel Kazamovich, Head of Research, One River Asset Management and Deputy Chief Investment Officer, One River Digital. Matt Sakurka, President, Endogenous. And Bloomberg's Eric Schatzker.
Hello, everybody. Once again. You'll see, if you haven't seen already, that the title of our panel discussion is called Out of the Rubble, Can Crypto Make a Comeback? Well, the truth is, crypto has already made something of a comeback. In recent days, Bitcoin topped $30,000 for the first time in almost a year. Ether today is trading at almost $2,000. But I do want to say this. We're not here. The purpose of this panel is not to rekindle speculative fever, the fever that fueled the bubble in 2021 and was followed by a crash in 2022. We're here to debate a very specific and important question, crypto's role in the financial system. So this isn't about Dogecoin, and it's not about Bored Apes. Matt here is an economist. He's a fellow at Johns Hopkins and at Durham University, and he has his own financial consulting practice. Marcel, as you've seen, is he describes himself as a recovering economist. He's the Deputy Chief Investment Officer at Coinbase Asset Management. And if you saw Marcel over the last 2 days, you also will have noticed that he's dressed himself down today, but there's been a little sartorial splendor at work, and I do wonder, Marcel, whether you travel with a Louis Vuitton steamer trunk. And Tina here is the Vice President of Policy and Regulatory Strategy at Circle. And Tina, I like to think of you as a refugee from the banking industry who found sanctuary in fintech.
Reformed. I'm a recovering banker. Yeah.
So to start things off, I want to do things differently. Each of our panelists has a strong, highly informed, and expert point of view on our central question. We could, of course, just talk and tease out those points of view, but instead I've asked the panelists to persuade you, the audience here in the room, the audience online. I want you to sell it, and I want you to sell it hard. Tina, I'd like to start with you. Persuade us. Why should or shouldn't crypto have a role in the financial system?
So if you look at the rate of innovation that we're experiencing today, I think we can all agree, is rapid. Looking at, we heard earlier this week about the European Union's attempt to put some regulatory framework around AI, and between when they started and now, they kind of have to go back to the drawing board because so much has happened, this kind of Cambrian explosion of technology. And what that comes with is an ability to be able to send and receive value and potentially other types of data, like your identity, for example, using the internet itself. And so you'll hear terminology like Web 2 and Web 3. And in Web 2, we had the ability to send and transmit communication. And we were able to layer on top financial service products that allowed us to send value. But there was friction in between those two because the internet wasn't designed to carry value natively. And ultimately, that's what digital assets allow us to do today. So what purpose does it serve in the traditional financial ecosystem? For me, it's a matter of choice. So I am not one of the proponents of, burn the government down and we're going to replace it with, only decentralized technologies. I think there's a role for decentralized technologies. I think they play an important role in our privacy and privacy enhancement solutions. And I think that's going to become more and more important for us as this Cambrian explosion of technology increases. But equally, there are going to be things that you're going to want to do in probably not that long, 2 to 5 years, that you won't be able to do with the euro in your pocket. And so ultimately, this technology allows us to send, receive, spend, save monetary value in a way that we were able to do with communication. And I think we can all agree that that's epically changed the way that we communicate with each other. And so I think that the way that we transact with each other will change materially.
Marcel, why should or shouldn't crypto have a role in the financial system?
Well, it should. And I go to my roots to start this question, farming, because it's so obvious from a farming perspective. Think of the Malthusian error in logic. The Malthusian error in logic was they were short innovation with that logic, and you never want to be short innovation. So as a farmer and growing up in a rural setting, and owner of a farm in upstate New York, by the way, it's gorgeous, and inexpensive. The main thing that I learned is it takes 3 days for us to farm that property. 2 days of prep and 1 day of harvesting. That's it. 3 days. Super efficient. And it's an inefficient farm. Rich countries have very limited employment in agriculture. Why? Because they've embraced innovation. Poorer countries have a higher percentage of employment in agriculture because they have not. Now think of that in the context of Bitcoin and digital currencies more generally. What Bitcoin did for the world was allowed value transfer between you and I with nothing more than an internet connection. And it's a remarkable peer-to-peer system. It also ensured that the digital asset associated with that was unique and could not be changed. So really, that's the kind of the train. Think of that as the train tracks of what we're building. Now, where do we go? Where do we go from here? How do we get to the root of the answer of why do we need this? What's the value proposition? I'll give you three simple examples of where I think we're going with this. One, costless. This is going to drive the marginal cost of financial transactions to zero, which is profound because we're operating peer-to-peer. And how does it drive it to zero? We're cutting out the middleman. What does innovation do? It cuts out the middleman. It allows us to do more with less. So costless financial transactions are the future. It allows us to operate in microtransactions. As an example, how many people here are long Bitcoin or have dabbled in this space? Just a show of hands. So a few. If you haven't, and you're curious what it feels like to do a microtransaction, I'll volunteer sending you sats. A sat is a Satoshi. A Satoshi is 1/100 millionth of a Bitcoin. So call it 3,000 Satoshis is roughly $1. So I can send you a bunch of Satoshis just so you see how it works, and you can operate in digital banking. Costless financial transactions, profound. It allows for micropayments. 2, value. Where do we get value out of this in the bigger picture? So the rails aren't that exciting. I don't want to say Bitcoin up, down, whatever it may be. You need the rails. We have those. They're super effective. Where does the value come in on top? So imagine being in Times Square and think of an advertising model in Times Square. You would see a big billboard with somebody that's getting paid hundreds of millions of dollars to showcase something like Nike. In the future, if you're wearing that Nike shirt and it's tagged as an NFT, you can get paid microtransactions for showcasing that shirt. So there's a value proposition. And the third quick point is truth. So now, did anyone see the picture of the Pope with the big white coat? It's an amazing coat, right? And I looked at it and I said, wow. And then everybody wanted to have this white coat. And it was a fake, okay? So you say, well, that wasn't the truth. So this is tricky. And now we have AI that's generating all these falsities. And you're like, well, how do we figure this out? Well, it's easy. Use blockchain technology. So that camera that's taking a picture right now will have a tag. That tag is an NFT. That NFT is going to sit on the blockchain. And then if I want to use that photo in the Financial Times or whatever it may be, that gentleman's going to start getting paid directly for that. So we've cut out the middleman and we've delivered value for the picture using digital rails. So don't short innovation. Blockchain generally is clearly the future of finance is a general matter, but much, much deeper than that. And Bitcoin started that revolution. So I'm very excited about these technologies.
Matt, your turn. Why should or shouldn't crypto have a role in the financial system?
All right. My position is that crypto as it currently exists has very little role to play in the financial system, and that some kind of full-scale reconstitution of the space may be necessary in order to integrate it. I will concede to my panelists that crypto offers ways of transacting that are decentralized, that are technologically interesting. But what we transact are tokens, and I'm reluctant to assign value to that token as a matter of course. In some cases it may exist, in some cases it may not. And in a way, crypto is a story and a process of trying to attribute value to these tokens that has been more or less successful in the course of its evolution. So to me, crypto it's a big space. It's very differentiated, and it's both more and less than the whole of its parts. The parts I would divide into Bitcoin, Ethereum, stable coins, other stuff that's trying to be money, other stuff that's trying to be corporate finance of some kind. But the whole, first there's the story. There's this gospel of crypto, so to speak, that ignites a religious fervor that begins in the financial crisis and says that really the cracks are appearing in the system. We can't trust the banks. Look at the explosion of the Fed's balance sheet. It was early adopted in California among doomsday preppers who are saying we need something that we can transact with and do business in when the government falls apart. I'm not sure that that's where the mojo of the industry is right now, but it does have this kind of apocalyptic, we need to get out of the system element that is both attractive and, I think, worthy of some skepticism. A second, it's a story about legal white space that I don't know can be sustained, but crypto as a product, one of its primary selling points seems to be to operate outside of legal channels for certain users. And it's also, in discussions around regulation, seems to be assumed that no regulations apply to it, and we need to sit down and write these things for the first time to figure out how to govern the space. Whereas other things that serve the functions that crypto does or purports to serve are already covered by a wide variety of regulations, and it's not clear why the attitude towards compliance in the space has been first absolute disinterest, and now a sort of come to Jesus moment of how do we sort this out. And third, it's a technology. It is a story about blockchain disintermediating things, it's a claim that the technology itself supports the legal white space, that because this is technologically different, it needs to be treated differently, which is a story we've heard from other big companies like Uber and Airbnb. They're getting into a space. It would be really easy to think that Uber is a taxi company. It would be really easy to think that Airbnb is a hotelier. When you try to apply those regulations to those companies, the reaction is kind of one of disbelief. Whereas for other reasonable people and for people who are subject to those regulations now, you would think that there would be more obligation on their part to comply. So I think the reason I say that the industry needs to be reconstituted in some way is that we've reached a space where a discussion about regulation has, in policy space, become so difficult and so small that I don't know how to go forward. Because you have a long line of institutions. Don't mean to implicate those for which anybody up here works.
We're fully regulated.
Yeah. But there is this long tail of companies that have really kind of flaunted the law from the very beginning, who now want the blessing of the law. But then there's also the story, and I'll come back to the gospel because I think it's important. And it's very hard for a government to engage with an industry where its primary value proposition or its core belief is that let's give the financial system a push so it falls down, and so that our product can come to the fore.
I'm going to pick up on that point. I didn't know how long it was going to take to get to regulation, but Matt, you got us there pretty quickly. He's right. There is a lot of evangelism, tech evangelism in crypto. And if, as Matt sort of describes it, move fast and break things, the sort of Zuckerbergian approach, is how the community behaves, will it ever make inroads into the traditional financial system? Tina, this is what you deal with on a daily basis.
Yeah, so, I think Matt raises a couple of good points, and I would disagree that there have been a couple of corrections, market corrections. You said crash. I disagree. And during those periods, there has been a contraction in the market, and typically that is when actors who aren't adding any actual material value and building things that people can use tend to go away. With any new technology, there's always going to be opportunists. That's just the regular hype cycle of innovation, and so that happens. The comment, though, I disagree with Matt, is that the majority of this technology is being used for nefarious purposes. That's just simply not true. We have loads and loads and years worth of data that demonstrate that that's not the case. Something like 1 point something percent or less than 1% of on-chain transactions is deemed to have any kind of illicit element attached to it. So that's a misnomer, and that's kind of an old school view. The regulatory treatment of these assets, again, I don't think is, now it's just starting to happen. Mika's been into discussion and development for close to 3 years. There's a number of jurisdictions that have already put things in place.
Europe being one of them.
Well, so MiCA will come into force in about a year from now. The final vote was today, actually, so it is official. But Switzerland, Gibraltar, Malta, Liechtenstein, a number of different jurisdictions have had frameworks in place. But equally, across the globe, there are other jurisdictions that have put in place rules of the road. This conversation often gets hijacked by what happens in the U.S. And it's true that the U.S. is a big economy, and it's also true that the U.S. is having a really difficult time struggling with how to regulate this space. But that is not to say that other countries aren't taking a first mover approach. The UK, Europe, Japan, Korea, Singapore. There's, across the globe. So, it's really kind of a call to action in the U.S. to try and figure out what they're going to do before people start leaving the jurisdiction for other jurisdictions that have figured this out. But I think in the early days, I don't think there were people that were trying to necessarily skirt regulation. I think that's an unfair classification. I worked for a very tiny exchange, Bitcoin only, the first in the UK. It's gone now. And in 2017, I was knocking on the door of Parliament and the FCA, begging them to at least regulate the trading platforms. So they didn't want to. They didn't know how to. They weren't ready to. So there are plenty of companies, and I could list a whole host. We must keep in mind that the stuff that you read in the papers, no offense, Bloomberg, it's much easier to report on stuff that goes wrong than to report on all the stuff that's going right.
Marcel, I want to know how you think about this from an asset management perspective, and specifically from yours, because what was once One River but is now Coinbase Asset Management serves institutional clients only. Mm-hmm. Institutional clients are not looking for risk for the most part, right? Mm-hmm. But many of those institutional clients are in the United States. Mm-hmm. And thus far, American regulators have taken, as Tina pointed out, a very distinctive approach to regulation, which is largely the laws on the books are the laws that apply to crypto just as they do to other securities and other things. Tell us how you think about it.
I think where we are on the regulatory side is, I would characterize as unconstructive ambiguity. I mean, because we still do not have clarity as to whether ETH, the underlying token asset of the Ethereum protocol, is a security or a commodity. The CFTC has come out with a definitive statement. It's a futures through the CFTC, and the SEC has been unclear as to their position on this. So where we are on the regulatory side in the U.S. is you have this massive amount of uncertainty. The value proposition that we can provide as a result is to say, okay, let's hold ourselves to the highest possible standard of a security. What would our product mix look like? And that's exactly how we've tried to conduct ourselves. And that's how we've explained it to institutions. I would say the vast majority of discussions with institutions right now is educational. So we're still at that phase. And think of it in the context of current finance. Tesla is roughly a 60 vol asset, 600 billion company plus or minus, probably a little bit lower today, similar to Bitcoin. So we talk about Bitcoin as though it's this pervasive risk, and it's speculative, and it's all these things, and it resembles exactly what we see with Tesla, that people are very excited about because of the technological innovation. And I think as you start to see the tools that are used on top of these rails become more pervasive in the context of a cell phone, you can have an ETH operating system on a cell phone now. That becomes your digital wallet. That becomes a decentralized source of communication, so on and so forth. You'll start to see the application layer start to dominate attention, and the focus on the speculative nature of the underlying technologies go away.
And can I just say very, very quickly that not all crypto assets are speculative assets. So, I work for a company that makes what you'll hear called a stable coin. We prefer tokenized cash because it literally is cash in the bank. People bring us dollars. We put it in a segregated, safeguarded account. We don't lend it. We don't hypothecate it. There's no credit creation. Those dollars sit there. They just sit there. They just sit there. And you can take that digital dollar and run around and spend it. And then if you want your dollar back, you come to us, you give us the token, we burn it, and we give you your dollar. So, the idea that all crypto assets have kind of no intrinsic or inherent value is, kind of a sweeping statement. There's a lot of different types of assets within the moniker, crypto assets. and not all of them are speculative in nature.
Matt, I'm going to pick up on a point that Marcel made. A lot of people will agree with what I suspect is your point of view, that at least in the Western world, traditional finance works pretty darn well. But as Marcel pointed out, it's expensive. I could cite credit card interchange fees. I could cite account maintenance fees. I could cite wire transfer fees. I could cite overdraft fees, although bit by bit they're disappearing. If, as Marcel said, the dream of crypto is to reduce the marginal cost of financial services to zero, would that not be a really good thing for society?
Well, I mean, the fact that things have positive costs attracts resources into producing them. And if the marginal cost of financial transaction really were zero, then, you know, what would Coinbase do? It's a lot. Yeah. I mean, it'd be all in on trading, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, there are ways to reduce the cost of financial transactions. Interchange fees are maybe too high, and other countries have decided they're too high, and they've put caps on them. The United States has flirted with that conversation at times and hasn't got there. But, you know, the idea that you have to pay for financial transactions, I think, gets distorted into the feeling that this is merely a friction and that the intermediaries who are making the transaction happen are not actually doing anything. Whereas intermediaries give you multiple things. They give you a clearing system. They give you recourse. They give you a certain amount of legal certainty in the transaction. They give you risk mitigation and risk measurement in various capacities. You know, even a simple foreign exchange transaction. You know, one of the big reasons to propound crypto is I can send anything in the world really fast. But you know, to be able to send value overseas across currencies, you need to have banks in two different jurisdictions that can trust each other. That when they were, yeah. Well, but
my nephew just got married. I sent him $500. I wanted to send specifically $500, so I didn't send a Bitcoin, which to his dismay, he got USDC instead. And it happened in 3 minutes. We both had a Coinbase wallet, so there was no actual transaction cost because it was operating on the chain. And you know, I was in the room with him when he got it, and it happened in 30 seconds.
Yeah.
So, no, I actually don't believe that there should be no cost. I think low cost is what we're going for. And I agree that there are other costs involved in financial services. There's KYC costs, there's AML costs, there's compliance, there's legal costs. I mean, there are costs to operating a business. A lot of the things that you've just discussed can happen within a smart contract and can be governed in a different way. We don't necessarily have to replicate the system the way that it is. But a very quick example, Circle is working with UNHCR, the United High Commission for Refugees, Stellar Network, and MoneyGram to provide assistance for refugees of the Ukraine-Russian conflict. These people are on the move. They've had to get up and pick up and leave their homes and leave everything of value behind. And so how do you get money to them? Typically, in humanitarian relief or disaster relief, you're palleting in cash. You're airdropping actual cash. It's not very transparent. There's a lot of slippage. There's a lot of corruption in the world generally. And so now the UN is able to deploy USDC onto this person's phone. Very, very easy to onboard. Happens within minutes. And they can cash out at any MoneyGram anywhere in the world. That cannot happen with banking today. It can't.
Yeah. Well, but, you know, we saw this also in Turkey. You know, they had an earthquake. People wanted to send money to help, and a lot of people sent Bitcoin. But then you have all these people in Turkey who need to sell Bitcoin for Turkish lira to be able to buy anything that they actually need. And the transactions costs of doing that are considerable. So if you want to start with currency and end with currency, you now have two transaction fees in between, whereas you used to have one. And the spreads are considerable.
Bitcoin. I just described to you using another crypto asset where that doesn't happen.
No, that's great. I mean, but it could be a money market fund too. I mean, it could.
Could it?
No.
No?
No.
So the marginal, we should be really precise here. The marginal cost of the transaction is zero. It's not that all costs disappear. And crypto banks can deal in dollars. They exist already. So these are banks. These are banks that have AML, KYC. You can't just walk in there. It's not Wild West.
And euros.
And whatever, they are banks. They They are not pseudo-banks. They are banks. So we have to be really precise how we think about these things. Getting the marginal cost of things to zero is wonderful. This is what innovation does. Now, second quick point, traditional finance. So think of somebody who's a strong opponent to these technologies. Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan. And I'm a JP Morgan client, and I love their service. It's expensive, overpriced, and they are overpaid. But it's a great service, right? I would prefer a better service. Jamie Dimon will routinely come on programs and emphasize that he doesn't want to talk about crypto, blah, 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 any longer. Okay? Great. JP Morgan has filed for a trademark on a digital wallet. That digital wallet does what? Deals in crypto. Because in the future, in the near future, not the distant future, we're all going to be working with wallets to satisfy microtransactions, and they can be in dollars, they can be in Bitcoin, they can be in Ethereum, whatever you prefer. Now, the sovereign is not going to give up the right to take taxes in their local currency. So I'm going to owe taxes in the local currency. That's a constitutional issue in the US. That's not going to change. Okay? I'm not going to pay taxes in Bitcoin. Therefore, the idea that Bitcoin and the dollar or the euro or whatever it may be are somehow oppositional is madness. They're complementary. I'm going to be paying taxes in dollars, always. I may choose to hold Bitcoin as an asset because I think it's going up in value, or I may not like the volatility and hold less of it.
But going back to the question about this being about, the banking system, there's 130 countries in the world that are looking at pulling together a central bank digital currency. The cash that you're holding in your wallet today, they want to tokenize. And they're going to issue it to you through the central bank. And the ECB, specifically in Europe, wants to do this direct to consumer. There'll be maybe intermediaries that kind of facilitate those transactions, but they want to cap how much you can hold. They will have access to the information around where you were and what you did and what you spent your money on. They can tell you what you can spend your money on. You can buy that, but you can't buy that. So ultimately, the financial system is moving toward tokenization, whether we like it or not. And so I started by saying we've got optionality, we've got choices. And so the more choices, the better, that allow us to transact how we want to transact. But the idea that everyone in this room isn't going to have access to, potentially forced to use, a digital wallet at some point, would you rather use an asset that provides some level of privacy and control, or do you want to use an asset that's given to you by the government that, the country that you live in and told how you can spend your money?
I, of course, like so many of my fellow moderators, have a million questions I could keep asking, but we're about to run out of time, and so I want to give each of our three panelists a very brief moment to say a last word. Matt.
Fiat money is not made up. Government money is not meant to expropriate you or to control you. For a very long time, the thinking has been we control the value of the currency to keep it in level with the things that people buy. There may be other ways to make those standards. I don't see a compelling standard in crypto that's likely to displace that anytime soon.
Marcel.
Never short innovation.
Tiana.
Explore choices. There's lots of different ways that we're going to be able to send information and send value. And having that optionality is going to be very important.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Matt, Marcel, and Tina.
Welcome Amos Hochstein, Special Presidential Coordinator for the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, and Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo.
Thank you. Mr. Hoxton, thank you so much for being here also on Bloomberg TV. Look, you're a real expert. It's not a secret that you advised President Biden, but beyond all of that, you have a real experience in the global dynamics that go into the energy market. And I think it's very fair to say last year, and I wonder if the audience would agree with this, it was a real shock to the system, particularly in Europe. How would you describe everything that we've seen in the past year, obviously as a result of the war in Ukraine?
Well, first, Maria, thank you for having me. It's great to join the conference, even if virtually. Look, last year, now we're talking about 18 months. It started really just before the war. Europe in particular, but the world took a shock to the system with a war that had an impact since Russia is one of the most important gas suppliers, not just to the world, but oil supplier to Europe, but an oil supplier to the world. We had to work together, the United States, together with Europe, with our allies in Asia, as well as the suppliers in other countries, particularly in the Middle East, North Africa, to surge capacity into Europe, and really in an unprecedented way for governments, especially the United States, where we normally don't get involved in energy flows so directly. But we were able to successfully come together structurally, do what we had to do over 2 winters, and get a little bit of luck, or a lot of luck, from Mother Nature on getting a rather warm winter. So I don't want to, it's not all just design of work of government, but we did get a lot of luck there in the system. But working hand in hand, the US, the EU, specific member states, and then Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Qatar, Algeria, et cetera, and worked, I think that put us in a much stronger position. But unfortunately, we're not out of the woods yet, and we're going to have to work on this winter by winter, season by season, because really working without, or at the threat of working without any Russian gas is still a challenge for the system. So we have to work and not take our eye off the ball.
Absolutely. And you talk about this change, massive change for Europe, going essentially overnight from no more Russian energy to finding other providers very quickly. For some countries, there was a real scramble, but there was this idea that we have to secure supply. When you look at the United States, you're now a huge exporter of LNG to the European Union. I wonder, though, last year was about just get a hold of supplies and pay whatever you have to pay in some instances. How is that going to become a more sustainable relationship in terms of the volume, but also the price point?
So I think that the difficulty there is on a number of fronts. One, the United States, yes, we've increased the rate and percentage of LNG from the United States going to Europe, but we didn't necessarily increase by all that much the rate, the level of LNG capacity, because that's something that is, as everybody in the audience knows, you got to build these facilities. They take years to do. We have a lot more capacity coming online next year in 2024. And then from 2024 to 2027 or 28, there's more LNG capacity in the United States coming online. And then, as you know, the Qatar expansion will be there as well. Between those, and as we ramp up, we're going to have to continue to make sure that Europe has enough gas to get through the winter. So one was certain countries in Europe took very strong steps in building infrastructure and putting LNG receiving capacity. That's really important. Germany's done a lot. Others have as well. But we're going to need to do more on the infrastructure. And we have a challenge here because we want to build infrastructure and we want to build supply and demand capacity for absorption while we're still in the middle of a energy transition that we're trying to accelerate. So what do you build now to sustain you in the shorter, medium term? And what do you do to make sure that you're not building something that will be, wasted assets later on down the road? So that's really a challenge. But in the meantime, the reason your question is why I say we're not out of the woods yet, because we have to, every year, we're going to have to figure out how do we have enough supply on the market, and things that you do year one, you may not be able to do on year 3. So we were able to see some of the Asian buyers perhaps letting go of some cargoes and allowing them to go, or reselling them to go to Europe to surge that capacity. There is limits to how often you can do that. Europe filling up storage to a much higher rate is going to help us. And as long as we get an average winter, we should be okay next winter. But we're constantly going to be working one winter at a time or one heating season at a time.
And sir, you talk about the challenges, but there's also a perennial question that comes up, and I'm sure the audience here, this is a question that we've all asked ourselves over the past year, which is, are these sanctions on Russia working fundamentally?
Well, my answer to that is always so far so good. I'd never say is it working on the long term because we're relatively new in this field, in this area of these sanctions. So I think they're doing what we hope that they would do, which is essentially two things. One is to allow for continued flow of Russian energy supplies onto the market so that we don't have energy spikes in energy costs, while at the same time reducing the revenues to the degree possible that Putin is able to use to both fund his economy and the war effort. That I think that is working for now, meaning we've set a price cap at $60 euros, or the blended price of Russian supplies onto the market has been mostly adhered to. We've seen a shift of Russian supplies from west to east, and that's okay. In other words, yes, India is buying a lot of oil, so is China, but we also know that there is a significant discount that's now built into Russian supplies. So we're going to continue to monitor this on a regular basis. We have teams that work together with the G7 countries to make sure we know what's going where at what price. That's a very dynamic effort, and it changes. But so far, I'm quite satisfied that we are able to manage global prices and avoid spikes as we the spike that we saw a year ago today. We're not in that world anymore, but still seeing that decline in price and discount being built into Russian supplies.
And yet, I'm sure you're not going to be surprised by the follow-up question to this, which is that cap. Is there any way that you could potentially debate we got to bring it down if we do see that price dynamics do go up and the implications that could have for Russian oil? Is that something that you're open to debate?
Absolutely. And we said from the beginning,
to what
this
point,
is going to
potentially?
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about prices. We have to look at where the global price is and what that impacts. So what you don't want is you don't want to create a situation where we're pushing the barrels off the market by making it not. In other words, it's a very narrow band of incentivizing the sale, but ensuring that it's heavily discounted. And that will change if prices go significantly up, and it will change if prices go further down. Just a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, WTI was below 70 and Brent was in the low 70s. Then it went right back up to 87. So we're in this dynamic right now in the oil markets where we haven't really stabilized enough to see where the trend is. But I think it has stabilized enough for us to know that for now the price cap is at the right place.
And can I ask you, just to wrap up on this point, when you hear some of your European allies who say we should talk about a range of 30 to 40, is that realistic in your view at this point?
Well, I think, different people, different countries have come up with different ideas. I think overall where we are today with the price cap reflects the overwhelming majority of where the G7 and Europe and the United States have been and are today. So I think we're in a good place. We look at this and we are the one thing that I can say since the war started that we have never, in my 30 years of working in this business, have been in a closer coordination and collaboration between the United States, Europe, and some of our Asian partners. It is the effort of Putin in this war to divide the transatlantic coalition and unity has failed miserably. In fact, it achieved the opposite. So, President Biden and EU President van der Leyen now signed an agreement in March 25 last year on cooperation on energy. That has continued and strengthened. So I think we're in a good place there. And look, lastly, I'll say on this, if you look backwards to 2014, 2013 to 2017, the things that we did together, the United States and Europe, on infrastructure, on energy infrastructure in Europe, had we not done them, all that hard work on Kirk Island LNG in Croatia, on reverse flowing the pipelines in the east, or rather the north-south to be able to go south to north, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Poland, all those infrastructure projects that took years to build and that were hard to do because the Russians were really lobbying against them. Had we not done them, we wouldn't be able to survive these winters, these last couple of winters. So this work that we're doing in a collaborative way makes a lot of sense, and it's what's helping us do that. When it gets at a price cap, we'll all work together to figure out what's right for both for the world, and to make sure that we put as much pressure as possible on Putin and relieve the pressure from our own consumers and economies.
And sir, a lot of the message from the Western leadership is that the days of Russia as a great energy provider, they're over. And either way, the Nord Stream blew up. So, I mean, it's hard to see how you get that going again. But I wonder, would you agree to that? This is over, the golden age for Russia as an energy provider to the world, that is over? And then a follow-up on this. Some would say the issue here was the massive dependency on a single country, that being Russia. Do you worry that is being replicated with other countries like, well, you probably guessed it, China?
Well, look, I think on the first question, I'm very cautious to be able to pronounce eras of over. Let's see how things develop. For now, Russia's actions, they're suffering the consequences. Russia's suffering the consequences of their own actions. They are not a reliable supplier. They, for years, said the one thing we don't do is we don't mix politics with energy supply. They did. They cut off, remember that they cut off gas supply to Germany long before sanctions. They have made themselves non-reliable, and they're going to have to, if this war, hopefully when this war ends and new leadership in Russia decides that they want to have a more rational approach and decide that they want to come back to the market, they're going to have to prove that they're reliable suppliers, and we'll see how that develops. I don't want to make any definitive pronouncements. But I think the main lesson here really is over-reliance on a single supplier, creating a single point of failure in the supply system is a mistake that was made over the last 30 years and was extended when it comes to gas. And we have to learn that lesson as we build a clean energy future. And you're right, China's taken a giant step ahead of the West when it comes to securing resources and the upstream and midstream of the clean energy. I mean, if you compare it to oil and gas, we're talking about the mining of critical minerals and rare earths. They have a leadership position when it comes to processing and smelting. They're in a leadership position. But I think that last year the G7 leaders got together to announce that we're going to work together on looking at how we disrupt that. In the United States, we passed the IRA and the Infrastructure Act. That is an unprecedented amount of incentives to build exactly that, mining and the kind of resources that you need to process them. We're now working in Africa and in South America to how do we build partnerships there to ensure that not that the United States has a supply chain, but rather that the globe, the world, has a diversified supply chain. We cannot allow ourselves to wake up one morning and find out that the 21st century energy architecture of clean energy looks too similar to the overly reliant on single sources of whether it's oil or gas of the 20th century. And that's not an anti anyone. That's not against anyone. It's for what we need to do to secure supplies. And as we electrify everything, and as we move our vehicle fleet to electric, we're going to need not just the critical mineral rare earths, we're going to need copper and everything else to be able to ensure a diversified supply chain that is free of geopolitical intervention and risk, as well as all other kinds of interventions and risks to the supply, so that we can have a secure world.
And you're not alone. The head of the commission, von der Leyen, also repeated this idea that you have to de-risk from China. Maybe it's impossible to decouple, but you got to de-risk in some areas. I want to talk about the global players. Obviously, OPEC. I know you went to Saudi Arabia. Just very frankly, how's your relationship with the Saudis at this point?
Look, I was in Saudi Arabia last week. We have a long-term, 80-year strategic relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. We have some areas of disagreement and many other areas of agreement. They are a strategic partner in a complicated neighborhood. But beyond that, Saudi is taking pretty strong steps in the clean energy. While being an oil supplier, they are also investing heavily in clean energy, not only in Saudi, but in a variety of middle-income countries and developing and emerging economies. So we're communicating very closely. Again, we're not always going to agree on the view of the market, but overall, I think that we're in a place that we have no surprises and notifying each other ahead of time, even when each of us take steps that the other may not agree with.
So if I understand correctly, what you're saying is obviously you may or may not agree on the moves, but you want a heads up. You don't want to be surprised by moves like this. That was your message to the Saudis overall.
I think that's a two-way street. I mean, that's for us to give them heads up and discuss things that we're going to do, and the same way in the other direction. It's really sharing information and understanding of the market. Look, we were informed ahead of time on the voluntary cuts, which wasn't an OPEC position. It was voluntary cuts a few weeks ago. As you can see, the market absorbed that with the rest of the data coming on demand build and how fast demand is building in China. And you see where the price is today. So sometimes you got to take these decisions and developments in the market not with an immediate reaction and see how they affect the market. We always know that these announcements have sometimes a shorter life in prices than the first few days may suggest. So again, we are working together on exactly this, on supply chains, on investments worldwide, and I think that relationship will continue. President Biden was there, as you know, almost just about a year ago. Since then, we have worked closely on areas from deployments of trusted vendors for 5G and ultimately research into 6G. We're looking at how to diversify supply chains, how to invest in clean energy more in a just and equitable way so that we can finance projects in emerging economies. So I think there's a lot there for us to work together on.
Okay, and I got to let you know, or go in this case, because I know you're busy, but I have to ask you about the SPR. Obviously, you pulled out from it majorly. A lot of this, the administration says, is in response to the war and external dynamics, essentially, that you had to attend to. You say you're going to treat this very responsibly. You have to replenish too. What does it look like in terms of, well, the timeline and price?
Well, I think President Biden wanted to take significant action at the beginning of the war, not to allow Putin to achieve exactly what he wanted, which was to destabilize the global economy and create divisions in the unity of most of the world against his horrific actions in Ukraine. And to that end, we did release an unprecedented amount from the SPR. Remember that we were at one point, about 13 months ago, 11 months ago, we were at about over $120 a barrel. Today we're at around 80. So I think that goes back to your first question of maintaining a global market that works towards reducing inflation and strengthening the global economy. We also said, the president has been clear that the SPR is a strategic asset and it is at about half full at the moment, still enough to be responsive to emergency, but one that we want to replenish. We will do that responsibly. And when the prices are right, we have to take into account that Congress in the United States mandated sale of a number of barrels this year over the spring summer. We cannot release and repurchase at the same time. We have to make sure that the system is operating well and maintenance is done. But I think that as we get into the early fall, if prices are in the right place, we are still 100% committed to replenishing the SPR over a period of time, because obviously it will not happen overnight. Even if prices are there, we will purchase as much as we can in a manner that, this is Bloomberg. This is an audience that understands the markets. We sold the oil at well above $90 a barrel on average. If we can buy back at $70 a barrel, that is both prudent, good management and of the SPR itself, and a good deal for the American people financially.
So that is the early fall, which should be, in financial terms, basically Q3.
Again, assuming we complete our sale I'm not giving specific dates here of repurchasing because it has to do with the market dynamic, and we have to complete the sale of oil into the market that was mandated by law.
Okay, well, sir, thank you so much. Always a pleasure talking to you. Appreciate it. Thank you for being here on this forum, too. And it's great to see you. Hope to see you very soon in person. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that brings to a close our program here at the Bloomberg New Economy Gateway Europe. I am mindful of your time and grateful of your patience, but please do allow me the luxury of saying a number of thank yous. I want to begin by saying thank you to our partners at IDA Ireland. As Peter Grauer, my chairman, has said, your warm hospitality and collaborative spirit were both welcome and essential to making this event a success. A thank you to my colleagues who worked so hard for so many months to create the rich content and amazing experience you've enjoyed these past 2 days. A thank you to our speakers for so freely and generously sharing their time, their ideas, and their insights. Many traveled here from very far away. And thank you to you, our delegates, for supporting Bloomberg New Economy and the Gateway Series. This began as an experiment almost a year ago in Panama. But after that gathering and now this one, I'm certain and we're certain that we have a model that works. I invite you to become part of our community and to join us in Morocco in June for the Bloomberg New Economy Gateway Africa and in Singapore in November for the annual New Economy Forum. I will see you there.